Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to talk about nonverbal communication. Right? Nonverbal communication and public speaking. So we'll start today actually with a question. What's the difference between these two statements? Now, if you got a keen eye, you may have realized they're identical. Right? These two messages right here are completely identical. Like the verbal message there is the same, yeah, you look great. Now let me ask you something else. What's the difference between these two statements? Yeah, you look great. And yeah, you look great. Suddenly, they have two completely different meanings. One means you look great. The other one means you don't look great, but I don't want to tell you. And the difference here is the nonverbal. And that's our subject for the day, nonverbal communication. So by the end of this class, you will be able to define nonverbal communication. You'll be able to define 4 channels of nonverbal communication that are most prevalent for public speaking. And you'll be able to determine 3 criteria for determining whether or not nonverbal communication is competent, is considered competent, right? So what is nonverbal communication? Why is it even important to understand nonverbal communication? Well, first of all, we define it as simply the messages people send to each other that do not contain words. Right? So pretty much every message we send, other than the words themselves. Right? All of our messages. Yeah, you look great. Those are the words. That's the verbal message. The nonverbal was the pitch change, the inflection change. Yeah. The pauses in there. Right? All of that, the hand gestures you have, the body movement, all of that's nonverbal. Right? And the verbal and the nonverbal messages really work together. And the nonverbal works to complement, accent, substitute, repeat, or even contradict the verbal message. Right? So it can complement the verbal message by just adding a little bit. Right? Oh, I'm angry. Or, oh, I'm angry. Right? The volume goes up, and it really sends that message of I am angry. Right? It allows that message to be sent a little more competently. You actually believe somebody's angry a little more if they have the nonverbal communication to complement it. Or it can accent your nonverbal communication, can accent the verbal message. Right? You can say, oh, oil drilling needs to stop. This is the worst travesty since, influenza, and we have to stop this now, right? You bang on the wall. We have to stop this now. That banging, right, really accents. It points to certain parts of your verbal message and says, oh, that's the important part right there. This has to stop now. And people realize, oh, it needs to stop now. That's the most important part of their message right there, is that we need to do something about this, right? It can substitute, right? It can substitute the verbal message. You could just say bye to your friend, or you could just wave. You could say peace, or you could just... Maybe your friends cross the way in a crowded subway station, and you need to get their attention. But instead of saying, hey, you just go like this, because you know they're not going to hear you. Right? So you can actually substitute. You can repeat the message. You can say, all right, peace, see you later. Actually say the words and have the nonverbal message right there. Right? You say, you got 2 minutes left. You have 5 minutes left. Say it and repeat the message. And finally, you can contradict. This one's one of the most interesting, right? Contradicting your nonverbal messages. You say one thing verbally, but your nonverbal messages, they're sending a whole new message, a whole different message, right? When these two contradict, which do you think we tend to believe? If you said the nonverbal, then yeah, you got it. Right? Our nonverbal messages tend to be believed over the verbal when they contradict each other. Right? When somebody comes up to you and you say, hey, how are you doing? And they say, oh, I'm doing great. I'm just fantastic. You know, life's good. Everything's good. Everything's going so right. You gonna believe that they're doing all right when their nonverbal messages are sending a completely different symbol? Probably not. And the reason for that's simple. Our verbal messages, we tend to intentionally send those. We tend to put conscious thought and effort into those. Our nonverbal messages, not so much. A lot of our nonverbal messages are sent subconsciously. We don't actually think about them. They just kind of seep out. So we tend to believe the nonverbal messages. And it's not that we can't. You can actively think, oh, I need to have better eye contact and consciously work on your eye contact, but we tend not to. Right? They tend to come more naturally. So when we're looking at nonverbal communication, we have 4 channels that we really want to look at for public speaking, right? And that's oculesics, kinesics, paralinguistics, and physical appearance. And these are the 4 that we look at primarily for public speaking. There are 8 out there total. But you know, things like proximity, they're a little less important in things like public speaking. So we'll start on oculesics, eye contact. Right? Basically communication with the eyes. Sometimes this one gets thrown in with kinesics. But you know, our eye contact is very important during a speech. How much eye contact should you have during a speech? You know, most speaking experts, they'll say 80 to 90%, right? About 80 to 90%, they say, for when you're giving a speech. It's a little less than that when you're just having a casual conversation. But eye contact's pretty important during a speech. It communicates competence and it really builds a connection with your audience. Again, this is one of those things that we tend to notice only when people get it wrong. Right? When we see somebody giving a speech and their head is in their notes the entire time, they're reading off their speech and they never make any eye contact, it really stands out. Right? They don't seem competent, they don't seem like they know what they're talking about as much, and they certainly don't feel like they're connecting with us as audience members. Right? So when you're giving your speech, try to avoid looking in one spot, try to avoid excessive blinking, and try to avoid jumping from person to person with your gaze too much. Right? These are the things you really want to avoid. And of course, try to get somewhere around 80% eye contact. Every now and then you'll turn to your PowerPoint, right? Or maybe you'll look up off into the side, or even check your notes briefly. It doesn't have to be 100%, but 80 to 90% is usually what you want to shoot for. And for kinesics, right, our body movement, right? We define this as interpretations of body movements used to send messages. Right? So kinesics is kind of a big one. Everything from your gestures and your posture to how you're actually moving back and forth. Right? I tend to pace a little bit during a speech. Some people like to be perfectly still. A lot of people will like to stand behind a podium, right? And they won't actually move too much. It depends on the context that you're in. But regardless, one thing you really want to work on is posture. Right? You maybe have heard this, and it's almost become a cliche, but you got to have good posture. You got to have good posture, right? Because this posture right here, right? This posture right here does not communicate competence. It doesn't communicate confidence. It doesn't communicate comfort, right? And it can be kind of distracting for your audience. But I don't want to be way up here either. Giving your speech, chest all puffed out, right? But you want to have good posture. Because people with good posture are seen as confident. And confidence is king when you're giving a speech. Right? People like to listen to people who know what they're talking about. Right? You want to take advice on how to get all swole at the gym. From some guy who weighs 300 pounds, with no muscle on him at all. He probably doesn't know what he's talking about too much. Right? You want somebody who knows, who's experienced, who knows what they're talking about. Right? So make sure you work on your posture a little bit. I know it's a cliche. I've got a lesson in here for you, a TED Talk from Amy Cuddy. Did great research on confidence in body language. So I'll send a link to all of you there so you can take a look at that a little bit later. But the message is essentially fake it till you become it, right? That's the title of it. And she's noticed that if you're not confident, just fake it. Eventually, you will actually become confident, and non-verbally, right? Things like fixing your posture. Just fake it, and eventually you'll get there, right? Eventually you will become confident. Gestures, another important one. What do you do with your hands, right? We don't think about what we do with our hands when we're preparing our speeches. Here, we work on all the things we want to say, and we want to make sure we've memorized everything we need to memorize, and we know what we need to go through, but we don't think about our hand gestures too much. And again, it only really becomes a problem when you're really stiff. And a lot of people get nervous and they won't move their hands at all. They'll have their paper or their outline in front of them, and you'll never see any movement whatsoever, and they'll give their speech, and it just comes across as nervousness, right? Which again, people want to hear from somebody who knows what they're talking about. So you want to have some gestures. If you're just completely stiff, if you notice you're recording your speeches, you're looking at it, and you're completely stiff, try to just work in a few little gestures, moderately, right? You just use gestures moderately, not too big, not too small. Of course, it depends on the context. Some serious topics, you probably don't want to have too many gestures, right? You don't want to have huge gestures for very serious topics. You don't want people to think you're making light of it or anything like that. So using gestures moderately, try to throw a few in, just a simple gesture to your presentation aid. Something simple like that can really go a long way. And most importantly, they really should appear natural, right? So practice with gestures, but you want them to appear natural because it becomes a problem when they appear unnatural, when you're unnaturally stiff, or you're gesturing to your PowerPoint, but it's not in sync with your verbal message. So if you see here, it is very important, right? If they're not in sync, it should appear natural. And the most important thing is that they become natural with time, right? If you just practice, that's one of the reasons we practice so many speeches up here. I try to have at least one a week for you guys, because you just need to get comfortable. And things like gestures will follow naturally. Right? Paralanguage is another big one. And essentially that is everything we're saying with our words other than the words themselves. So vocalics is another name for it, but our use of voice to send nonverbal messages. Right? How you say it. Right? It's not what you said, it's how you say it. You ever hear that one? I've gotten that one before. Right? It's not what you said, it's how you said it. Because how you say it communicates a lot. Right, so looking at paralanguage, volume, our first section here, a few things to avoid. Make sure that you check the acoustics of the room. You don't want to be too loud or too quiet. Right? If you're too loud, it's distracting. If you're too quiet, people can't even hear what you're saying. Right? If you're too quiet, people can't even hear what you're saying. For those of you in the back who didn't even hear that. But yeah, if you're too quiet, people can't hear what you're saying. And that tends to be the bigger problem for speakers, for novice speakers, is they tend to be a little too quiet. So make sure you just understand the acoustics of the room, the size of your audience, and background noise, right? If it's raining heavily, you're going to need to get a little louder, right? And a good technique to use when you're practicing is when you start your speech, just look at the people in the back of the audience. If you see them leaning forward or kind of confused, you probably need to be a little bit louder, right? And pitch. Pitch is changes in lowness, highness of your voice. Right? Or sorry, inflections are actually changes, but pitch is the highness or lowness of your voice, right? So are you speaking really, really high tone, very low tone? You really want to avoid extremes. But the most important thing here is that you actually change it up, right? If you have one pitch throughout your entire speech with no inflections, that's what we call speaking with monotone, right? Being a monotone speaker, right? So you really want to avoid being monotone because it's just the most boring thing. And really volume, the same thing, right? You don't want to have one constant volume. Sometimes you'll get louder, sometimes you'll get quieter, but especially with pitch. You really want to avoid being monotone. Make sure you change it up a little bit, and try to avoid repetitious patterns. Right? So the only way to really find these is to, again, record yourself and see if you're falling into patterns that are making you sound a little more boring. Right? You'll usually recognize it. We're very good at recognizing when these things are off. Right? So honestly, just recording yourself is one of the best ways to find a lot of this out. Rate and pauses are our last two that we're going to talk about for paralanguage. So the rate at which you speak, everybody has different styles. But again, it's try to avoid the extremes, not too slow, not too fast. Right? You don't want to sound like a used car salesman who's just coming out with 1,000,000 words a minute. And that's not going to help anybody. But then speaking too slowly is just boring, right? Again, so try to avoid the extremes. Too quickly, too slowly, and try to avoid speaking at one constant rate, because you have to have some variety. Again, vocal variety really is the key to all of these. Right? Switch it up, speak a little quicker, speak a little slower, right? Depending on where you're at in your speech. Pauses will help with this as well. Use pauses, emphasize powerful points, signal the end of a thought, or even give the audience time to process information. Former President Barack Obama, he was great at using pauses, if you want a good example of somebody using pauses. But just don't be afraid to pause. You do want to avoid the awkward pause, though, right? The awkward silences. And again, if you just record yourself, you'll notice them. Like, record yourself and watch yourself speak. You'll know when a silence is just a little too long, when a pause is too long. If you pause in the middle of an idea, that tends to be kind of an awkward moment, right? All right, so physical appearance, our last channel of communication. And the things you really want to think about with this is how formally do you want to appear for your speech? Right? Those who appear formally, they tend to come off as a little more competent. And those who dress more casually tend to come off as a little more approachable. So you do want to ask yourself, what do I want? Right? For this speech, this occasion, because people are going to judge you before they ever hear anything come out of your mouth. Right? And maybe, we've been told don't judge a book by its cover, but we do, honestly. We naturally do this. And you have to expect it. So be ready. Ask yourself, do I need to appear competent? If you're at a business meeting, yeah, dress formally. Communicate competence. If you're having a speech with young people, high school students or something like that, and you're trying to get them interested in science camp, then you maybe dress down a little bit. Right? Try to appear more approachable. And grooming, of course, too. People are seen as more credible if they're viewed as attractive. And maybe you thought, well, we can't just change our level of attractiveness. Well, absolutely you can. Right? We do it every morning with grooming. Right? Comb your hair. Put on makeup. Right? Whatever your routines are. Brush your teeth. Right? All these little things, they do make us appear more attractive and therefore more competent. And our last thing for the day, competence in nonverbal communication. And the real key here is sticking to those moderate areas. Right? There's actually 3 criteria, motivation, knowledge, and skill, that will determine whether or not your communication comes off as competent. You have to be motivated to actually communicate competence. You have to know how to communicate competently. And then you have to have the actual skills to do so. Right? I've told you all this before, but public speaking is physiological just as much as it's cognitive. Right? You can know how to hit a baseball. You can know the perfect angle to hit a baseball, to knock it out of the park, how much force you need. That doesn't mean you can walk up and hit a home run every time, right? Because you actually have to practice the physical skill, right? So it's the same with public speaking, nonverbal communication. Make sure you have the skill, make sure you have the knowledge, and make sure you have the motivation, right? You come in here and you're not motivated to give a good speech, you're probably not going to give a good speech, right? So moderate displays, those tend to be where you want to stay. And then competence of nonverbal communication skills depends on context, of course. right? What's competent here is not going to be competent in a conversation or a different context, right? So our practice activity, as usual, we're going to do a practice impromptu speech, right? So for this impromptu speech, I want you to think of 3 items to convince your classmates that are the most important to buy at a time like this when we're preparing to go into lockdown, right? Several states have already gone into lockdown, right? So what are the 3 most important items? And I want you, while you're giving this short impromptu speech, 1 to 2 minutes, to focus on exaggerative gestures, right? I want you to be big. Because if you can get comfortable doing huge gestures, then you can get really comfortable doing smaller gestures or moderate gestures, right? All right, so once we finish this up, we'll finish up with the Kahoot, same as usual. Log in, get a point for participating, and a point for everyone you get right.